Hi, this is our Zoom EA meeting discussing evolutionary states. Thank you so much for joining us today. The discussion will center around understanding the same evolutionary and karmic dynamic within different evolutionary states. And this is a really important topic because in order to interpret EA or in order to interpret a birth chart, in the correct way, we must have the individual context. No one size fits all. So the evolutionary states are essential in terms of determining that individual context. So evolutionary astrology is based upon individualized context. The different aspects of the chart that we need to consider before we interpret it are cultural religious conditioning, gender, economic state, and evolutionary condition. For example, when we're looking at a blank birth chart and we don't have the individual context, those archetypes could manifest in a variety of ways within that archetype. So when we have these mitigating factors such as cultural religious conditioning, gender, the economic state, and the evolutionary condition, we can then determine the individualized context in which to interpret the birth chart. Again, no one size fits all. The living reality for a woman in Africa is different than the reality or the conditioning of a woman living in the US. There's also different conditioning factors based upon, again, male or female, what economic state you lived in, what economic state you grew up in, and exposure to any religious or cultural conditioning factors. Those are going to play a big part in understanding how that birth chart is going to be expressed. And when we take in that individualized context, we can also then give life to those dynamics within the birth chart. So much of evolutionary astrology is listening to the client's reality. Astrology does not create life, it can only reflect life. As such, through listening and through determining that client's reality and developing a language that suits, that is able to play back that person's reality, we can then become expert counselors over time. Where we can have a way to tune into that client. We can have a way to give that birth chart an individual life that the client is actually living, their actual reality. So again, what I've learned through practicing evolutionary astrology is to take away all my assumptions, to really look at that birth chart to get the core foundation, to get the archetypes, and then let the client take it from there. Ask questions. Evolutionary astrology is based on observation and correlation. So having said that, there are 4 natural evolutionary states or conditions of the soul. Again, these cannot be determined by looking at the birth chart alone, but through observation and correlation and asking questions. So for example, before you do a reading or before you look at a friend's chart, try to determine from your own observations of that person, what evolutionary state are they in? Do they seem to be just breaking out of that box, out of the consensus box? Do they seem to are developing a hyper state of alienation from society and defined through rebellion? Are they more in a place to where they're trying to understand the universal applications of life, where everybody's journey in a holistic sense, aligning with timeless natural laws, trying to get their baseline? And that will again give the proper context for the chart. So one of the first evolutionary states that we won't typically see is the dimly evolved. Souls are just evolving into human form from different forms of life, such as plant and animal life. This can manifest as those with special needs, such as Down syndrome, cognitive delays. The core to take away from this is that those who are just emerging into human form They're just getting used to human consciousness. They're just getting used to being in a human body, what it's like to be in human form, etc., which is why it can manifest as cognitive delays or special needs, because that soul is just adjusting to life in human form. In very rare cases, this can occur for evolutionary and karmic, through evolutionary and karmic necessity. The soul is literally being restricted or held back through de-evolution. Now that takes a lot. Again, this is an extreme, it takes extreme cases for that to happen. But from my understanding, what you can see in the difference, let's say, for example, if you're interactive with kids with special needs, or even adults with special needs, those who are just forming into human life, who aren't being held back but are just emerging into human form, they'll typically be there will be light around the eyes, typically very innocent. Their root desire is to be just like everyone else, meaning those in the consensus. Those who are being held back, there's typically a very dark presence within the eye, within their eyes, that typically they react with an extreme amount of anger because the soul remembers having been more evolved and is extremely frustrated at being held back. So they can cause a lot of either self-harm or harm to others. So look around the eye and see the degree of light. If there seems to be more of a light or more of an innocence about that soul, then you can, most likely that soul is just evolving into human form. And if they tend to be very angry, harm to oneself or others, very dark around the eyes, those are typically souls that are being held back. I want to encourage you to ask questions throughout our Zoom meeting today, so that we all stay on the same page. So are we kind of clear about the reason why the evolutionary states are critical to apply within evolutionary astrology, or kind of how we're starting in terms of the dimly evolved state?
Yes.
Okay. So the next evolutionary state is the consensus state. This is ruled by Saturn. Roughly 75% to 80% of all souls are in this evolutionary condition. It's ruled by Saturn, so it means that the core or root desire within this evolutionary state is to learn how the system works in order to progress within it. So it's learning the social ladder, which is absolutely essential. I want to also emphasize that these evolutionary states are simply a natural evolutionary progression. It's a progression that each and every soul has to make. It's going through a ladder. And as such, each stage is absolutely essential in that regard. Or I guess I want to emphasize the dynamic of equality, that these evolutionary states are not meant to single out or to make one class better than the other. Is to show the natural progression so that we can understand the actual reality of any soul that we're interacting with. I know for myself, just to know these evolutionary states helped me so much in terms of understanding different conversations, the language being used, understanding different people's orientation to reality, and so on. So I want to impart that this isn't made with any judgment. It's simply a natural progression, and from an EA point of view, it's critical to understand the actual reality of any soul that we're interacting with in order to help, or in order to understand how EA can be applied to them, and potentially even as friends, even if it's just for our own self-study, to understand the progression, or to understand the evolutionary condition. So in terms of being ruled by, again, the consensus state being ruled by Saturn, these souls are learning how the ropes work, how to progress through the social strata in order to progressively get on top of the social system. In the first substage, because there are 3 different substages within each evolutionary state, in the first substage of any evolutionary state, it's when things are just beginning. The soul is just emerging into that evolutionary state. In the second substage of any condition, it's where it's established. And in the third substage, it's where that evolutionary state is culminating. So in the first substage of the consensus, these souls are just beginning to learn how the system works, a very limited awareness of the immediate environment, typically in the lowest economic condition. So just beginning to understand how society works and so on. When we get to the second substage, that's when these souls are keeping up with the Joneses, so to speak. They're coming out of that just beginning awareness of how society works, of their immediate environment, and they now have progressed to the awareness of, well, what does everybody else have? How did they get that? They're keeping up with everybody, keeping up with the Joneses. They're typically in the middle substrata, and they're wanting to progressively gain what those in the top level of society have. So in the second substage, it's really keeping up with everybody, so to speak, or learning what I need to do in order to get on top of the system. In the third substage, again, this is where there's a culmination of the evolutionary state. In the third substage, the soul has learned everything that it needs to know about how the system operates in such a way as that they've progressed to the very top or the very highest social strata. These could be the CEOs, the political leaders. In essence, these souls too also have learned either how to integrate into society in a way to, in my point of view, they can either use this knowledge to help society itself advance or to help others in society who are in the lowest strata. Let's say, for example, they could use their knowledge of the existing laws, customs, and regulations to help those who are in the lower class progressively proceed, whether it's through advocating education for those who are struggling to afford it, training classes, or generally promoting the improvement of life circumstances, of life conditions, and that's their orientation to their position. And for others, it can also manifest as the temptation to manipulate the social system for their own advantage. So from my understanding, in this third substage, there can be an intensity around having this knowledge around how the system works and how are we going to use that knowledge. Are we going to use that knowledge for manipulative purposes to advance myself, my career, and so on? Or am I going to use this in a very non-manipulative way and get to the top in order to improve that system itself? That's kind of black and white, but that's really how I see the emotional field of this evolutionary state. And within that, because it is culminating, it's pointing the door towards the individuated state. The soul can progressively exhaust that desire for to be on top of the system, for the wealth, for the social status. It can simply grow tired of this because part of the evolutionary current that we all feel, no matter what evolutionary state we're in, when we exhaust a desire, there's always this sense of there must be more than this. There must be more than this. Sometimes you can't put your finger on it, but there's this constant feeling of reaching out for a reality that's deeper, perhaps, than one that we have, or that is more than we are currently integrated within. And in this evolutionary state specifically, how that will manifest is the progressive exhaustion of desire for wealth, for monetary gain, social status, etc. And that's exactly that feeling or that emotion that pulls them into the individuated state. In the individuated state, it progressively liberates the soul from the conditioning factors from Saturn, from the consensus, and so on. But before we move to the individuated state, I want to check in and make sure that we're kind of clear about the baseline of the consensus. How through the first substage is just becoming aware of society and so on. And then in the second stage, it's keeping up with others. And then in the third stage, it's getting to the very top. How it's ruled by Saturn, so it's the social norms, conforming to the social norms, not being able to see anything outside of that. So it's, for example, if somebody in a consensus state were to hear an opinion from an authority, they would accept that as truth. There wouldn't be any independent thinking that this is what the authority said about the matter, so I'm going to believe it. It's coming from the quote-unquote experts, so they must know. When we break into the individuated state, that soul is now desiring to think for itself. It's ruled by Uranus. The root desire is to individuate from the consensus, the mainstream, from the conditioning patterns within that mainstream. As such, these souls will reject the mainstream opinions to desire to think for themselves. So are there any questions about this unfoldment or about this progression so far from the consensus to the individuated? Okay, because individuated in this sense is very Uranian. It's in the Jungian sense of the word, and essentially the soul is breaking out of being the quote-unquote automaton at times, or it's breaking out of being defined by society and by the mainstream reality, and really opening up to its own mind, to its own individuality, to who I am outside of that. And in the first substage, because this is brand new, the soul is just beginning to break free from the consensus, and there's a growing feeling of being very different from those in the consensus, and yet that feeling typically triggers insecurity and also fear. What does this mean about me that I'm different than those in the majority? They're progressively through the individuated state, you become secure with your individuality, but when you're in the first stage individuated, it's a very sensitive and very insecure dynamic to feel, because you don't really know how to, in this state, you don't really know how to bring that out. It's more about feeling that way inwardly, but not really knowing how to bring that out in a Uranian way. So typically what happens is that these souls, due to compensation for feeling different, not really knowing how to sit with that or interpret that, fear of rejection and persecution from those in the consensus, typically these souls create what's called a living lie. They live a very different inward reality than what they look like on the external. Because very typically these souls will do all the things that the souls in the consensus do. And yet when nobody knows, or when they think nobody's looking, or maybe with those who are also in the individuated, but very, very inwardly or very, very private, they may begin to check out things that are different, whether it's the taboo, whether it's taking a divination class, but anything that deviates from the consensus, that will be kept very private. So the struggle here is aligning one's inner life with the external, to give way of the compensation, to, in a sense, integrate through feeling that it's what makes us different that makes us special or unique, or that's where our power lies, is by being different in that sense. So that happens over time. But in the first stage, it's very much about just breaking into that, feeling very different from those in the majority, and the desire to liberate from conditioning patterns that are left over from the consensus. Um, when we go into the second stage, individuated, remember, in the second stage of any evolutionary condition, it's where it's established. This can be a very tricky phase because the soul has broke out of that first stage compensation, and it's now completely defined by one word: rebellion. In this stage, it's nobody is going to tell me what to do. I'm not going to integrate into society at all. I'm not going to let anybody else make up my mind. I'm going to, rebel against all the external should-bes and so on. And that's very necessary in the context of progressive individuation and liberation. The danger of that is that the soul is then stuck through non-integration and through typically a rebellious pattern, meaning that the soul is kind of caught in its own fear of being reabsorbed by society. So typically the fear says I have to rebel against it, or else I'm going to get reabsorbed into it, and all of my hard-won individuality will be lost. So typically you won't see these souls in your chair because you're the authority, and they're not going to have any of that in this stage. Again, it's necessary, and the trick with this type of evolutionary stage is to always, if you know somebody or have experienced this, is to always try and come simply as a friend. That's been my experience, to try and any advice that is sought or any way to integrate or interaction is always helping them also feel that it's always their idea, not yours but theirs. So there can be really subtle ways of kind of working with that, to where the soul then feels empowered. They feel like it's coming from themselves. This is my own idea, so I can integrate it and take it in and so on. I found that to be quite helpful for myself, um, uh, being quite rebellious in some ways. So that's been something I've noticed through observation, is to work with it more from that context, from always extending friendship more than anything else, and always trying to help the soul feel empowered. This is your idea, or helping them come to come to it on their own, so to speak. And again, the trick here is that they feel that their individuality is going to be absorbed if they integrate into society in any way, which again, this then points the door towards the third substage, or opens up to the third and final substage of the individuated evolutionary condition. This is when the soul has broke free from that fear of being reabsorbed, and now has developed what can be called brilliant or genius capacities. And the trick here is that these capacities must be integrated within the mainstream in order to help that mainstream advance or evolve, because the soul has developed the capacity to see beyond the mainstream, long-term vision, and so on. The task in this evolutionary stage is to integrate these different unique Uranian ideas in the context of mainstream society, in such a way that progressively what's held out there long enough becomes integrated. A classic example of such a soul is Albert Einstein. How at first his ideas were seen as, of course, revolutionary, but progressively they were integrated. He's a wonderful example of a third stage evolutionary soul. And outwardly, he looks very much like a soul in the consensus, even though he's in the individuated. But his consciousness was in that third stage individuated, in terms of bringing forward a unique or brilliant or genius capacity in such a way that it helped mainstream society move forwards. And because it's in a culminating phase, when we see the third stage, the soul is progressively exhausting the desire for individuation to liberate from the mainstream, and it's relative to that core feeling of there must be more than this. That feeling of there must be more than this in this context is pushing that soul towards the spiritual state, opening up to a progressive union with Source, to understanding the universal purpose, or the purpose that we're on collectively, so to speak. And it's a feeling of, from my understanding, you could also see it as, in a way, it's almost like Leo leading to Virgo, to where you necessarily become full of yourself, or you become full of what your capacities are. You're individuating, so to speak, and You're breaking free from the consensus and getting in touch with your gifts and so on. And then you move into the spiritual state, and all of a sudden that Virgo hits and you become aware of just how small you are from an egocentric point of view. It's a necessary humbling effect. At least that's my point of view, or that's my perspective. So when you transition into the spiritual state, it's almost the feeling of Leo transitioning to Virgo, to where you, having necessarily become full of what you are, that Virgo becomes aware of being a progressive, a feeling of being that proverbial speck of sand along the beach. So it's a very powerful transition in terms of uniting with these natural principles, or with a reality that's larger than yourself, so to speak, which again is a natural progression. Um, so in the spiritual state, it's ruled by Neptune. Roughly 2 or 3% of all souls are in this evolutionary state. The root desire within this is to merge with the source of all things, or the creator. Within this is the desire to serve others in some way as a reflection of the service to the source. An alignment with natural principles takes place. So in essence, it becomes to unite with that which made us, the creator, to serve others in some way. And in the first stage spiritual, the desire to serve others is paramount. It comes out in terms of typically desiring to start healing centers in some way, to be of service to something larger than ourselves, to benefit the whole. It's very Virgo, the first stage spiritual. The soul can become aware of all its lacks and imperfections, and the danger point within this is that it can undermine the intention to actualize innate spiritual gifts. So what you'll hear is, one more reason why, why I'm not ready enough, why the soul isn't ready enough, or if I were to, I'm just not feeling, perfect enough yet, or whatever the dynamic is. And so that can become a hang up, or that can become a place where the soul gets hung up on its own lacks and so on. So in terms of counseling, or if you yourself or have friends who you get a feeling are kind of hitting this mode to where it's very Virgo in the sense of creating crisis and so on, or the undermining the intention to actualize. It's that remedy of just taking it one step at a time. The road to perfection coming one step at a time, so to speak, and trusting that what you're feeling connected to in terms of wanting to serve, that will come about if you just keep taking those steps towards it. That can be a way to release those feelings of overwhelm, or even paralysis at times, which I know we can all experience at various points. And again, emphasizing the experience of feeling of being just but a small speck of sand on the beach. So are we on the same page in terms of the transition from the individuated state, where the soul is rebelling against the social norms, discovering its own mind, in terms of being able to establish itself in an individuated context, independent from the mainstream in various alternative realms? The example we used in the very last stage was Albert Einstein, and how progressively we're transitioning then into alignment with natural universal laws to be of service to something larger than ourselves, and so on. Uranus to Neptune. And seeing that shift, going through each rung of the ladder, and how progressively we're merging with that which created us. Are we on the same page so far? Any questions?
Yes, Deva. Is there a lot of trauma associated with the individuated state, maybe more so than the consensus in the spiritual?
Oh, it is ruled by Uranus. I would say that those in the individuated state experience trauma for a very different purpose than perhaps those in the consensus. I can't really speak to more or less. I mean, I can certainly see how that may be true. But the trauma experienced in the individuated state is very much to pull the soul away from places where they may have been attached to consensus reality, may have been compensating in some way. It's like to accelerate that individuation process that soul may have been resisting. So souls in the individuated state very typically do experience trauma, perhaps through social isolation. Another form of that would be having a group of friends they were then ostracized by, or in some way needed to liberate from. Maybe they found that their values weren't in alignment with the group they had been affiliated with at some point. But from my understanding, working with that, it would be to really understand how that trauma is igniting that individuation process at that stage, and how that soul may have experienced trauma in the past relative to its own individuality, for maybe being different, or for speaking different ideas. You'd have to look at the birth chart to know exactly what necessitated the trauma. But from my understanding, it's definitely an experience to propel that towards liberation, liberating from any residual consensus compensation.
Thank you. I was looking at it though. Um, I guess the consensus would tend to want to try to pull that, um, pull that individuated, especially the one in the first, probably the first stages, pull them back, because they sense them climbing out of the boiling water. And people, in the individuated state sometimes will tend to point out, those um, things of the consensus, and people typically react kind of violently when their beliefs are challenged. So I guess
Oh,
that's where I was coming from.
oh yeah, no, and I hope I answered your question in
Yeah.
the way you intended. Yeah, because that's exactly right. Remember that one of the quotes that helps me, and that came from Albert Einstein. It says, "When mediocre minds meet brilliance, expect violent opposition." And that also, from my point of view, that's exactly right. It creates it's an insecurity, because in the consensus, their security, we look at the polarity too, Capricorn Cancer, the security point comes from that sense of conformity, that we must be right because we're conforming, and it's that sense of belonging, or that sense of security coming through the conformity. So to have, from their point of view, to have somebody different from that or not conforming to it triggers that insecurity. So your point is that's exactly right. It can create violent opposition. It can create a feeling of threatedness, remember too that Aquarius archetype can also manifest as projected judgments. So a lot of the times those who are in the consensus, and you can carry, I mean, uh, this is something we've all experienced, but they can be very Saturn Aquarius in terms of projecting what should be onto others in a very fixed. Aquarius can be a very fixed pattern, fixed air sign. So there can be a lot of projected judgments that come in terms of, those in the individuated being told by those in the consensus what they should be doing, what it should look like, what's appropriate and not appropriate, and so on. So it can create too its own sort of mental trauma for those in the individuated state, because it's like they also have to, from that point of view, become very detached, or they have to remain in a place of aloofness in order to see in an objective way what those projected judgments are about. So there's this interface between Saturn and Uranus, and at times, depending on evolutionary condition and other factors in the chart, the Aquarius energy can manifest as a very strong should be. And for even an example in the individuated state, those can be souls too, looking at the consensus saying, well, you should. So sometimes it's this funny interaction between those in the consensus saying you should, and those in the individuated also saying, well, you should. So it becomes this, it can kind of become this back and forth, and there's certainly a Uranian lesson there in terms of objectification, but yeah, threatening that emotional security button, I think, is an important aspect to look at too, and how anybody who's not conforming to the mainstream will automatically challenge a defensive reaction.
Thank you.
So in the second substage of the spiritual state, the soul, from my understanding, programs a sort of fall from grace in terms of the soul identifying with universal knowledge or knowledge of natural laws. The ego, in a sense, wants to hang on to itself, and it wants to say, in a sense, I'm the teacher. This knowledge is mine. It's coming from me, so to speak. And it's, from my understanding, it's difficult too, because the soul in this evolutionary stage has received or has been in touch with various natural laws or principles, or it has claimed a certain degree of knowledge, and it's like the testing ground is whether that soul is going to want that for egocentric purposes, or whether that soul can release that, so to speak, or recognize that these revelations or experiences or whatever knowledge has been given to the soul, that in sense that the soul is not the creator of that knowledge, or to not attach to it from an egocentric point of view. And in various stages or extremes, it doesn't always manifest as an extreme. I know, for example, my father shared a story of the raving mystic kind of getting on a horse with a bullhorn, riding into all the towns with the bullhorn. Hey. So it's, I don't want to, my point in bringing that up is that I don't always want to present this as scary, or that there's that the soul becomes malevolent. There are certainly experiences of that. Like, from my understanding, an example of an extreme is Rajneesh. He's an example of a soul in the second individuated state who really fell prey to this need for egocentric claim, or acknowledgement, or what have you. And so it can manifest in various extremes. And the point, from my understanding, is that it's almost a trial by fire, and that the soul is cleansing or purging any egocentric attachment. So it programs this phase in order to re-humble itself in a way. So does that make sense in terms of the intent of this phase? And how the soul doesn't necessarily become malevolent? And I know it, when I was, was trying to get my head around this, or, trying to understand the intention of this phase and seeing its different forms. And an extreme form would be souls like Rajneesh, or perhaps Claire Prophet, or the like. But it doesn't always manifest by that. It's like an egocentric purification, very Scorpio in its own way. So do we have any questions about that? Okay, so in the third stage evolutionary, in the third stage spiritual, this is where the soul has made it through that final testing ground in terms of ego soul, ego soul, ego soul. And there's the soul is completely identified with the creator from an egocentric point of view. The soul has developed a capacity of this and other lifetimes. The soul in this stage can manifest capacities to impart teachings that will withstand the test of time and that also can travel internationally. It's not limited to a country or a state. It goes all around the globe because of the universal nature of the work that the soul is doing. Another marking ground of this spiritual state is that because of the inherent purity of the soul, and that the soul again has released any egocentric attachment to whatever the work it's doing, they can become sources of projection from others who are interpreting the soul from a very egocentric point of view. So they can essentially become lightning rods in a way, I want to be careful about the way I frame that, but they can become the sources of very many projections from others who are, haven't developed enough capacity to see beyond that, if that makes sense, or projecting their own egocentricity into that soul. So they can become, in their own way, threatening to those who have these kind of impurities. So it's a dynamic too in terms of that soul staying only attached to the work that is being directed to do, and almost allowing the cleansing or that's coming through the work to speak for itself, or to allow the work just to come out the way that it wants, and to trust that over time it becomes imparted to those who need it, so to speak. So the challenge here is doing the work for the work's sake, or keeping the work going and trusting it will become imparted to who it needs to be imparted to. So I guess the core of that is that these souls, again, aren't attached to the teachings that are coming through them. They've developed the capacity to spread work all around the globe internationally, and that they always promote too this fundamental understanding that a true spiritual teacher or whomever never points the way to themselves. They always point the way home. So they don't advocate themselves as the way to know God, Goddess, or as a they never point to themselves as the source of the teachings. They always point the way home. So that's a good way of knowing who's who. So does that make sense so far in terms of the third stage spiritual, when the soul has rid itself of any egocentric identification and is able to impart teachings that can stand the test of time globally? Um,
Yes, this is great. Thank you, Deva.
oh, I'm glad this is making sense. Seeing that progression too, I mean, that's why this is so important to understand, not to backtrack too much, but to really emphasize this point. Let's say, for example, if we were to, because the majority of those who will be in your counseling chair or friends or whatnot will be in the individuated state, but look at the difference between the first stage individuated and the third stage individuated. Look at that gap there. Look, I mean, we're not going to be looking at the birth chart in the same way if we know that soul is just emerging into the individuated state, that they're just becoming secure with their individuality, of feeling different, of most likely are going to be trapped within that inner lie of so much wanting that inner life to come out, but so afraid of the judgment. What do I do? How do I stop creating a lie? Yet so much wanting so, yes? And now let's look at the third stage individuated. That soul is, that soul has gotten out of that has progressed to the third stage, individuated, to where it's now meant to integrate its unique or genius capacities within the mainstream. So in terms of the language, in terms of how you're going to support that soul, empower that soul, even though they're in that same individuated state, look at that difference between the first and the third stage. It's a big gap. And that's why it's so important that we identify where each soul is, evolutionarily speaking. And this doesn't necessarily have to come from us. It can come from, you can also ask any given soul where they feel they're at and go with that. You can ask through observation and correlation, just by the nature of their questions. So often you can determine where they're at just by the questions that they're asking. So I really wanted to impress that point, to really look at the progression here from the first to the third stage of any substage and seeing how big of a gap that is. And so it's not lumping them together in that one state, individuated. It's really looking at which substage they're in too, to see the progression within that. Because then you can get a very accurate read of how those archetypes are manifesting again in the first stage, individuated, from the living lie, compensation, just blooming, just budging into that individuated state to the third stage, where that soul is now again meant to reintegrate back into the mainstream their gift or their special or genius capacity, and who really have to hold that long-term view. From my understanding, that would really be what you impart to that kind of a soul in the third stage, is to just, if it's legit, if this capacity is something that, is based upon moving the mainstream forward, it will be integrated over time. So you have to take that long-term approach and just keep holding it out there, holding it out there, holding it out there. And I mean, not to get too personal, but my dad shared with me, I think the Pluto book was rejected over 30 times, if not more. But, lo and behold, one day it was accepted and it went from there. So my point in bringing that up is, and he's definitely in the spiritual state, but to promote that long-term vision that anything that's different typically gets rejected at first, but if it's something that's valid based on natural laws, so on, progressively it does become integrated. So does that make sense in terms of seeing this progression and from first to third, and adjusting language, adjusting to that client's reality, and so on?
Deva, I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you think that people go back and forth between stages and substages over the progress of their life?
That's a very great. Oh, go ahead.
Or do you think that they just, have one stage, one substage that they, goes through the whole life?
That's a great question, and you can be, thank you for asking, you can be on the cusp. Sometimes you can be on the cusp of, let's say a soul is on the cusp from the third stage consensus to the first stage individuated, they're transitioning. So they can cycle back and forth between that third stage and the first stage until the transition is complete. So there are cases where the soul is fluctuating or where they're on the cusp, and they may show characteristics of both substages or of both stages. And I know, for example, the one that really popped out for me was looking at Hillary Clinton, because especially through what happened here in the States, I feel that she's really transitioning from that third stage consensus and really being propelled toward that first stage individuated. So, she may have been on that cusp or on that cycle where at times being able to see beyond the consensus, but then, kind of fluctuating back and forth. So there can be those kind of experiences, but generally speaking, there's a baseline, or that the soul is generally, it takes a while to evolve through the evolutionary states. So, I mean, we can all feel shades of both. I mean, I know for myself, there are times where I personally have a South Node in Capricorn, so I'm like, wow, like I can still feel my shades of Saturn reality. But my point in bringing that up is that it's really identifying with the core, because I know at my core, I'm definitely not somebody just conforming to the mainstream. But you may feel shades of both, or even all three. You may feel points where you're individuated. You may feel points where you feel a bit Saturn, but it's really about reflecting on your baseline and feeling what kind of your root orientation is, and going with that. Does that help in terms of shifting it out? Because we all have a Saturn, we all have a Uranus, and we all have a Neptune in our chart. And I know for myself, again, there are times where there are days where I feel like, wow, you know, I'm really feeling my Saturn shades today. But it's really kind of looking at the core and seeing, going with that in terms of determining where you feel your evolutionary stage is at. So does that help?
That's great. Thank you.
Okay. That's a great question. So are there any questions so far in terms of this progression from consensus to spiritual, and why EA incorporates those, or why we're going to use those in terms of determining context? Because again, you can't look at a birth chart alone and determine these things. It's through asking and answering questions. It's through observation and interaction with the client. A lot of the times, through their own words, they'll be able to give you a feel of which evolutionary state and sub-stage they're in. So it's a natural science. It's based upon observation and correlation and so on. And how we're really working through Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, and how it's a natural progression. It's going up the ladder. We all have to know how the system works. We all have to individuate from that system at some point, and then further down the line, uniting with that which created us. So it's a natural progression. It's a natural pathway, and it's a way to give that birth chart individual life or individual context. So I thought a really great way to illustrate that would be to look at Yogananda's chart, but I'm not really keeping track of the time, so I'm wondering, how are we feeling? Are we wanting a break, like a 5-10 minute break, and then come back, or?
Yes, I think we need a 10-minute break, so we'll see you back in 10 minutes.
Sounds good. So before we start examples of looking at the same birth chart in evolutionary state, the different evolutionary states, I'm wondering if we're all on the same page, if there are any questions that we'd like to discuss before moving forward. What we'll do now is apply again the same evolutionary karmic dynamic in the birth chart, in the consensus, individuated, and spiritual, in order to integrate how it dramatically impacts the expression of the chart. We'll also look at different substages. So any questions so far about these evolutionary states?
Yes, is there any state before these states or after these states, or is that it for really the whole of creation, would you say?
Oh, that's a great question. And it may be that there are some that precede and go out and that are after. From my understanding, after reaching the avatar or guru condition, that you've exhausted then the desire or the need or to be on earth, or there comes a time where you are in the astral plane or causal plane, and there might be different states that go beyond our Earth or ours. So from my understanding, these are the states that we use to for evolutionary purposes, or to read progression here on Earth. And you know, what comes after or before it may be, and just kind of staying open to that. um,
Great,
but it's,
thank you.
yeah, thank you for the question.
Okay.
So yeah, looking at these states in terms of looking at progression from life to life, looking to at how to frame or how to work with the individual birth chart. And the chart I felt would be really good to use in terms of applying these same evolutionary karmic dynamic in the same, or looking at the same birth chart in different evolutionary stages, is Yogananda. He's a guru, and he's been able to impart universal teachings that have stood the test of time. They've reached the globe. People are still, in my point of view, his work will always be available to souls who, when they're ready. And looking at his birth chart, he has natal Pluto and Gemini in the 10th house, conjunct Neptune. So how, relative to his evolutionary state, he has been accepted as a quote-unquote spiritual authority. Pluto, Neptune in the 10th house, specifically through communication. We have Pluto being in Gemini, also Neptune being in Gemini. The power of his words. And looking at the South Node then being in Scorpio in the 3rd house too, the power of him being able to speak universal natural principles in a way to where there was no doubt. He always advocated direct perception as well, not blind belief, but to find these things out for yourself. For example, too, by always speaking truth. He has Venus conjunct Mercury in the 4th house. He was able to enhance the power in his own words because they were unpolluted by any untruths. What he spoke was always coming from a direct communion or a direct connection to the source, looking at Pluto, Neptune. So through the power of speaking truth only. And looking at this too, how he was able to write one of the most beautiful stories that I think I was reading too in his autobiography was he was given a task by Yukteswar that was really challenging, that he had to leave India, look at the nature of the 3rd, 9th house access, South Node being in the 3rd, North Node being in the 9th. And he was directed to come to the U.S. to spread these teachings to the U.S., where in the U.S. was primarily scientific, logical, industrial, and so on. So it was bringing these spiritual principles to the West. The East meets West, so to speak, and within that was the challenge of English. That he did not know how to speak. He did not know how to speak English, and yet he had to give lectures and so on. So he wrote that while he was on the boat, while he was going over to the U.S., he was able to learn English through necessity. Look at the North Node being in Taurus in the 9th house. Well, I have to learn how to speak this if that's what you want me to do. Then you have to teach me how to do this. Again, it's evolutionary state, but in terms of the power of his mind, or in terms of the power of communication and being able to assimilate very quickly a whole new language. And also bringing spiritual principles where he felt very at home. India was a place where he felt naturally was his home, so it was like he was taking his home with him, looking at Pluto being in the 10th house to the 4th house. So being rooted in your own inner home, no matter where you go, taking India with him, so to speak. 4th house, 10th house, 3rd house, 9th house, going international and the challenge of language. And in addition to that, when he was very young, he lost his mother. And so you can see the theme of traumatic loss being emphasized by Pluto opposing Venus, fourth tense. I think he was only 7. And through that, though, relative to evolutionary state, because the key within that is that it's how we respond to trauma. And that will definitely be dependent upon evolutionary state. And relative to his evolutionary state, he used that trauma to find the Divine Mother. It was right after she died that he, of course, through intense grief, intense loss, South Node in Scorpio, he asked if he could talk with his mom, and he reports that the Divine Mother came to him and said, "Don't you realize it's me who's been watching after you lifetime after lifetime in these forms of mothers, but it's always been me. So, find her in me, so to speak." So relative to his evolutionary state, he was able to use that trauma to seek the Divine Mother to help him work through his grief. And how he was able to also impart using loss in the same way for those who had experienced grief, traumatic loss, and so on, to use that grief to spiritually develop, or to seek the Creator, and to find solace through that. He also, looking at the Venus and Sagittarius in the 4th house, conjunct Mercury, he started a school for younger children that incorporated not just the intellectual ideas, but it was very well balanced. It incorporated yoga, the academics, physical activity, but it was very well rounded. It incorporated spiritual growth as well as intellectual. So again, yoga, he often brought the children out into nature, also as natural forms of learning, looking at Venus and Sagittarius in the 4th house. So that was also natural for him. He reports feeling that he was simultaneously mother-father to these little kids, or to the kids that were in his school. And he taught essentially a way of life, or foundations for life, and being a well-balanced person, and so on. So that's relative to evolutionary state, looking at that Venus conjunct Mercury in the 4th and opposing Pluto in the 10th, and also Neptune, that one of the things that came out in early life is he was always very unorthodox, because Pluto being retrograde in the 10th house. So he didn't want to conform to the structure of things, especially when it came to education, that he wanted to impart true communion, or alignment with natural laws that would help people blossom into their essence, looking at North Node being in Taurus in the 9th, or propelling them towards uniting with spirit. And looking too at the North Node being in Taurus in the 9th house, how he ultimately he imparted Kriya Yoga in ways that he tried to reach everything very simply. Taurus in the 9th, trying to consolidate teachings, trying to boil them down to their root, in order to intuitively teach them to the masses, so to speak. So preserving a core message, looking at that North Node in Taurus, or simplifying things in order to teach, and also allowing the power of his voice to come through. Looking at South Node on Uranus too, we can see that theme of liberation through ideas, liberation through communication. So in this state, we're essentially looking at these archetypes as being somebody who advocated, or somebody who was able to dispel darkness through the transmission of universal or natural principles, and how that came through international travel, 3rd, 9th house, and also through teaching. When he was teaching schools for younger children in India, looking at the Mercury-Venus conjunction in Sag. So that kind of having that as a root, are there any questions or comments or insights about his chart at that level of evolution?
Deva, what level of evolution was he exactly at?
Avatar.
Thank you.
David, could you clarify the avatar? Is that within the spiritual state, or is that beyond the spiritual state?
Oh, yeah, that comes right after the third stage spiritual.
Okay.
It's right when the soul essentially loses any desire but to unite with spirit. And I remember that what Yogananda said the mission of his life was to inspire all hearts to know its creator, or to inspire others to also know God. And that was his primary reason for the life here on earth. So essentially it's that process of, through progressive evolution, exhausting every desire but one, the desire to return to source. And when you reach the guru stage, all those desires are gone. At least that's my understanding at this time. And that's a great question. And if there aren't any others in terms of, let's look at this at a lower spiritual stage. We looked at it at the highest spiritual stage. Let's say, for example, if he were in a first stage spiritual, even in a lower stage spiritual, how would this manifest? That he wouldn't necessarily have the ability at this point to impart teachings globally, or there would be a sense of needing to pierce through, looking at Pluto on the 10th, Neptune, to dissolve egocentric barriers that were preventing a direct and conscious merging with Source. Look at the Pluto Neptune and look at the South Node being in Scorpio in the 3rd. So the soul is definitely aligned with spirit, with natural laws, with spiritual principles, has the desire to serve others, as a desire of serving Source. There's a need to dissolve the leftover conditioning factors, perhaps unresolved guilt, looking at the 10th house, looking at South Node and Scorpio in the 3rd. It would really be desiring to understand these principles at a bottom line level. So in essence, it would be sorting out what's based on timeless natural laws, and I want to structure around that, and what's essentially delusive in nature, looking at the Pluto Neptune. So it would be very much dissolving these kind of unconscious conditioning patterns in such a way that the alignment with timeless, universal, or natural laws became the very basis of how the soul communicated. Look at the South Node being in Scorpio in the 3rd house. Also conjunct Uranus, so the soul would have an ability to communicate this knowledge in a transformed way. South Node Uranus. So the difference here is that the soul is just emerging into spiritual consciousness, is just beginning that process of identifying with Source as its core reality. Is just beginning that process of, with South Node Uranus, reinventing itself relative to these spiritual principles. So it's still, and I don't want to say still like that, but the soul is transitioning into that. It's not in the culminating or final stages of it. The soul is just beginning to understand these universal or timeless laws as a way of reinventing itself as well. South Node being in Uranus. The soul could have also experienced trauma for communicating these ideas. Look at the nature of South Node Scorpio conjunct Uranus. So the soul will definitely have unconscious memories of experiencing a form of trauma around communicating these ideals. Does that make sense in terms of what the soul is just transitioning into? How the soul will certainly have the capacity to impart this knowledge to others in a unique or transformed way. So let's say, for example, the soul could transmit the knowledge that these principles aren't really new, that this is something that emanates from the past. Look at the South Node in Scorpio. So it's not essentially trying to, oh, look at these new principles or look at this new idea. It's looking at where these principles are emanating from. What's the core? What's the root? What's the bottom line of this? Seeing that South Node in Scorpio and releasing any delusion or releasing any unconscious conditioning that's preventing the soul from merging with Source. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So we could look at this too. Let's say the soul is in the individuated state. Let's look at this same karmic dynamic. Let's say if the soul is in the third stage individuated, how would this be manifesting? The soul would definitely be somebody who would not allow themselves to have their ideas or who would not allow themselves to be brainwashed in any way. Look at the South Node on Uranus, or I mean, this would definitely be a very strong speaker. Somebody who knows their own mind, who is also able to impart timeless or universal ideals within a social context. That would be the big difference between the individuated state and the spiritual state, because remember, in the third stage individuated, the soul is meant to integrate their brilliant or genius capacities within the social system. And look at Pluto being in the 10th. Conjunct Neptune, and look at the South Node being in conjunct Uranus with Scorpio there too. So the soul would be learning, or the soul would desire to communicate this timeless knowledge in such a way that the social system itself would advance. So let's say, for example, bringing in the ideas of individual psychology that could advance the field of psychology itself, looking at the South Node being in Scorpio in the third, so this soul could have the capacity to, for example, reinvent how people were thinking of the whole field of psychology. It could potentially include traumatic memories, looking at South Node, Uranus South Node, but we get the feel of that, right? That would include the natural basis, or it would include the knowledge of timeless laws through the social system. So, for example, the soul could find that it's bringing its special gifts into the realms, let's say, of a past life regression, the whole field of psychotherapy, those kind of fields. Does that make sense?
Dave, I have a question.
Yeah.
Would there be a push in, especially in this particular, in the individuated state, with Pluto, the ruler of the South Node, and Uranus, and so tightly conjunct Neptune, both being retrograde in the 10th? Would there be this real push to bring out this new language?
Absolutely. There may be a memory there of having these ideas either considered too much a departure from the norm, or maybe the soul itself had rejected or rebelled against this intention, looking at the South Node there with Uranus. So yes, there would be a big pull to bring those forward, or to establish that, to bring these ideas forward, perhaps because of a memory to where this wasn't, it didn't happen in the past, or it was something that the soul needed to revisit. So it would definitely give that push, or it would definitely give that feel of it being very important for the soul to do in this lifetime. let's say, for example, too, if we were looking, let's put the chart in a lower evolution, a lower individuated state. Let's say it's now in the first stage individuated, where the soul is just beginning to break out, where the soul is just beginning to feel different, can create that discrepancy between the inner life and the outer life, the inner lie. This soul would deeply, although this would be private, the soul may not externally challenge or confront those who were in positions of authority in terms of how to, not wanting to be intellectually repressed or stifled. Pluto 10th house, Neptune, both being retrograde, Uranus South Node, Scorpio in the third, there would be a very intense inner questioning of all of the soul's also inner conditioning. So it would be questioning those who presented themselves as authority, and it would also be very much questioning its own conditioning patterns. Well, what makes this right? What makes this wrong? Why is this correct and why is this not correct? So there would be a very deep questioning of the inner conditioning of who to trust, who not to trust, who really wanting to establish its own mind, and to would again create a deep questioning of all the information that's coming in. And again, also its own internal conditioning. Let's say, for example, the soul would be questioning its own should be's. Why do I feel that I should be this way? Like really wanting to get to the basis of that. Who determines what's right and wrong, and so on. And with the North Node being in Taurus in the 9th house, it would be to progressively self-consolidate through its own individual truth, or through its own personal sense of truth, not the beliefs defined by the consensus, but by the values that the soul naturally holds. This is my inner orientation, for example. This is what I find to be most valuable. So this could be a soul, for example, looking at the 4th, 10th house, 3rd, 9th house, who was able to impart alternative teachings by perhaps letting go of a career that had held a high position of status. Pluto, Neptune, South Node, Uranus. They were reinventing themselves through releasing what they felt no longer had meaning. So let's say, for example, the soul transitioned from a mainstream type of system and integrated more in an alternative system to where their sense of values were reciprocated, and there was more of a sense of being in alignment with their personal truth, South Node being in Taurus in the 9th. So it may be that they didn't make as much money as they did. All of this is coming into question. So for example, this could be somebody that inwardly decides to live on less in order to be more happy. So I can withstand a cut in my paycheck as long as emotionally I'm feeling better about who I am and what I'm doing. That's that 4th, 10th house too. The 4th house wanting to touch base with itself emotionally, to kind of resolve those unconscious conditioning patterns of the consensus. So in this evolutionary state, it could be a transition into a more alternative line of work that the soul progressively begins to feel fulfilled by. But first would come that really deep and intense examination process. Do I really need to fit into this system anyway? Or, all of that questioning knowledge that's coming in, and really making the baseline, the intuition, or the North Node being in the 9th, what that soul feels most personally aligned with. So are we on the same page there? How in the first stage individuated, this would be really somebody who's really feeling pulled to bust through or break out of the system. Would be deeply questioning information coming from quote unquote external experts, would be wanting to establish their own ideas in a more alternative way that would allow more of an inner sense of fulfillment, or more of an inner sense of being aligned with what the soul inherently values. And that would be within an alternative realm. So in this case, because North Node in Taurus, it's that happy cliche that sometimes less equals more. And how progressively, maybe not in the first stage individuated, but maybe in the second stage individuated, the soul would be drawn into confrontation or would definitely not be somebody who shied away from asserting his or her point of view. Like this would definitely be a soul who was resistant towards absorbing or towards being told what to think. That to me is what really pops out. And in the first state individuated that may be more private, the soul may be progressively withdrawing or maybe doing that inwardly, and kind of an inward attitude of that, inwardly withdrawing from the consensus. But how different on an inner level, a soul who in the individuated state won't allow itself to be told what to think, or won't allow itself to be controlled by others, to be manipulated, looking at the South Node there. So that's kind of what would be welling up to always have its own individual freedom, looking at also the Jupiter and the Mars in Aries, in the 8th house, to think for itself, to speak its own ideas, and to not be censored or blocked in any way. To finish up the individuated state, how in the first stage individuated, that soul too, the journey would progressively be making the outside, or the outside congruent with the inside. So aligning with an alternative form of work, especially because we're looking at Pluto in the 10th, could be a means to bring what's on the inside in the outside in a way to where the soul can sustain itself, North Node being in Taurus. So how there's this whole process of feeling secure with that, feeling secure with one's individuality to break free from compensation. In a sense, to perhaps to break free from its own unconscious memories of trauma, looking at the South Node being conjunct, looking at Uranus being conjunct the South Node in Scorpio. So the soul progressively, like a mantra that a soul could use to help, and this would help anybody, would be to remind itself that it's to find strength in being different, to find its power in its individuality, to break free from those fears, and to allow compensation to give way. So any questions about the chart in the individuated state, how it would manifest in the third stage and in the first? Okay. So in the consensus then, let's go ahead and let's put this chart in the third stage consensus. And this soul could definitely be somebody who was able to transmit the knowledge of how to succeed within the system, or very deeply penetrating insight into how society works. You could see that the soul may have run the risk of using that knowledge for its own manipulative purposes, or definitely kind of struck the chord with the 10th house lesson of how one can use authority in a proper or in a positive way, and how authority can be used in a manipulative way or in a deceitful way, looking at Pluto, Neptune, South Node, Scorpio, Uranus. So the soul has learned how the system works, is also most likely really deeply feeling those evolutionary lessons of how to assume a social role in a way that allows the soul to really grow into its depth, or to really grow into its potential, seeing the South Node being in Scorpio. So how to hold a social position in such a way that it can also grow past its own limitations, or that really allows the depth of the ideas to be communicated. Looking at the South Node being in Uranus, South Node conjunct Uranus in the third, and that could lead to a progressive self-sufficiency, an orientation that also allows the soul to align with its own belief around how to use authority and how not to, what those in positions of authority, how they can also use ideas in a transformative way, perhaps how to transform an existing field within the system in a consensus way. But it could be, for example, bringing in a new idea within the consensus, which would then allow self-sustainment, self-sufficiency, an ability to perhaps teach, looking at the Venus, Mercury, and also North Node being in the ninth. So there's that deep sense of reinventing. In this case, it's going to be within the mainstream. So the soul would be a powerful communicator, and may have, in other instances, may have spoke out against others who misused their authority, or who really advocated that those in positions of leadership really use those positions in the best way that they can for non-manipulative purposes and so on. Does that make sense in terms of what the soul, the pinch, or how that soul could potentially be communicating within the consensus realm and the new ideas that they could bring in? Again, this is all in the mainstream at this point. It would just be reformulating or perhaps communicating ideas that are in the mainstream in a different way in order to pioneer, looking at the Mars, Jupiter, and also seeing that Uranus South Node to invigorate, or to bring something to innovate, to bring in an innovative idea. So in this state, it's a soul holding a lot of knowledge around how the system or how society works, and perhaps too the psychology of the consensus of perhaps also teaching different ways to get ahead, looking at that Uranus South Node, but definitely the dynamic of powerlessness, establishing oneself, and the proper and improper use of authority, and ultimately becoming self-sustaining within that system, looking at the North Node being in Taurus. Perhaps one way to do that would be through higher education, seeing the North Node being in the ninth, or pursuing the necessary education that allows it to become self-sustaining and to bring in these ideas. Looking at the moon too, and Leo in the 12th, making a trine to this Mercury Venus in the 4th, could be a very inspirational speaker. Could potentially be somebody who inspires through oratory, perhaps higher ideals within the mainstream or within the consensus. That could be one manifestation of this chart too. So any questions about how this chart could manifest in these different evolutionary states. Any questions so far? Q&A?
I just had a thought with Yogananda's chart, the way you were describing it in the, trying to look at it from the consensus state. For some reason, what kept popping up in my mind is that that could really be the chart of, the prosperity preacher.
Yes.
I don't know why. I don't know why I
Yes.
just kept thinking.
Very, very much so. Well, thanks very much for participating and the dialogue that we had about the evolutionary states. I appreciate all the support. Also wanted to let you know that there's a new evolutionary astrology book out called Evolutionary Astrology that's a compilation of previous workshops and lectures of my father. So it's essentially one comprehensive book, all EA in one book. So I would highly recommend checking out that book to get the foundation or the main paradigm of evolutionary astrology. It's really exciting and kind of the all-in-one book. So if you want more information about it, please let me know.